Women of Wyoming Then and Now is brought to you by the Wyoming Historical Society and supported in part by a grant from the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund, a program of the Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources. This program features unique female perspectives on events, themes, or narratives related to state history. We, the host, believe that one woman's action toward a better future can result in a greater legacy that inspires and equips many generations of women to come.
Welcome. I'm Linda Fabian, lay historian and author, today's host of Women of Wyoming Then and Now. Joining us as co-host is author and historian Janelle Maloney. With us now is our special guest, Johanna Wickman.
Hi, I'm Johanna Wickman, and I'm here to talk about one of my projects at the Fort Caspar Museum about installing headstones for soldiers who were killed at the fort.
How exciting! I can't wait to hear more about that, Johanna.
Johanna, already the things that you've done in your life and the work that you have accomplished as a historian and a museum professional has been very impactful to other women in particular, and we think will be for generations to come. For our listeners, though, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on or something you've done that will impact future perspectives of Wyoming history, and in particular, women?
I feel like one of the things that I'm working on now that's going to have a big impact is my headstone project at the Fort Caspar Museum. But we're working on installing headstones for all of the soldiers who were killed at Fort Caspar. And this is a big deal. In the 1970s, they installed headstones for 11 members of the 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry, which is great, but that does not honor all of the men. And so it became a situation where I felt it was almost like, well, you get a headstone and you don't, and you get one and you don't. And I didn't feel that was right. And so with this project, instead of having just 11 headstones, we'll actually have about 50. So it's going to be a dramatic difference. And that's something that their families will be able to visit, descendants, and will be around for a long time, which is fantastic.
Johanna, will you give us a little bit of an example of what the time period is that these soldiers served, and also how long you've been working on it and how long do you think it's going to take?
So the headstones are going to be for soldiers who served when the fort was in operation, when Fort Caspar was open. So that's between 1862 and 1867. I started this project in July of 2022. And so far, we've been able to raise funds and install the headstones for the 11th Kansas Cavalry. So that's a block of 9. So our next set of headstones is for the 6th West Virginia Volunteer Cavalry. Then we'll be doing the 6th U.S. Infantry, the 18th U.S. Infantry, and I'm putting the 11th Ohio for last, the 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry, because they have so many. They have about 20. And I have to vet each name, verify their service, vet where they passed away, and make sure that they were on duty at Fort Caspar when they died. So I'm saving the hardest one for last. I'm hoping to have the project finished by 2026. That's kind of my farther date out. If I can do it, I would like to have it done by 2025. That'll be the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Platte Bridge and the Battle of Red Buttes. And so I would like to have the cemetery completed for that, but 2026 is my final date. I'm hoping to have it done by then.
And I think recognition of those deceased military veterans is really important and very, very dear to your heart. We can tell that. Obviously, in your career, you are working in kind of a male-oriented, history-related industry, so to speak. Yes.
Very much so.
Right. Yes. How do you handle that, and how do you study and interpret men's history maybe differently than other history that you've worked on?
Ooh, good question.
So to answer the first part, one of the things that I really put a lot of focus on is knowing my material. If someone is not going to take me seriously or be dismissive, the more material I know, the more information I can present, then the more credible I am. And in a lot of cases, when I have not been taken seriously at first, once I start talking about these things that I know a lot about, that completely shifts the whole perspective. And as far as telling history differently, I definitely do that. And that's something that we incorporated into this recent 11th Kansas Cavalry exhibit at the Fort Caspar Museum. Having worked at the Wyoming Veterans Museum for about 6 years here in Casper, one of the things we did there was we focused on the veteran stories. So each case was a specific veteran story. And I really liked that idea, and I've kind of run with it. And so when I present military history, to me, it is so much more than, well, there were 12 men in Company B and they went to the left. And then someone else arguing, well, I thought there was 10 and they went to the right. It's like, well, who were these 12 guys? What were they like? What jobs did they have? What did they do before the service? What did they do after the service? What were their personalities like? To me, that's far more interesting. You know, when you're presenting history, especially the further back in time you go, the harder it is for people to relate to it. And I look at history as I'm presenting, whether it's an exhibit, a presentation, writing a book. I want people to relate to it. I want people to get sucked into it and identify with it. And I found that really at its core, history is stories about people. And everybody loves stories about people. And there's a lot of people who will say, oh, people don't like history. People aren't interested in history. No, people love history. They may not realize it. They don't like the dry facts and figures, almost sterile presentation of history. They like stories. And the best way to reach people with history is through the heart rather than the mind. You want to have facts, you want to have information right, but you want to tell stories that people can relate to. And when going through, especially, you know, Civil War cavalry soldiers, that's not something many people in the 21st century can relate to. But they can relate to, you know, walking long distances or not having enough food sometimes or going to bed hungry. You know, there's stories about some of the soldiers that we tell in that exhibit that are more human focused. So for example, a lot of people in Casper know the story of the Red Buttes, the Battle of Red Buttes, and that Sergeant Custard was killed. What a lot of people don't realize is that Sergeant Custard was a widower. He had 2 children that he was responsible for raising, and he was so committed to preserving the Union in the Civil War that he enlisted in the 11th Kansas anyway. And he had been through hard fighting before coming out here, and the Battle of Red Buttes orphaned his 2 children. Now that's something that people can identify with. Now they get pulled into his story. And so for me, when I present history, I try to find as much information as I can to not only tell their story factually and correctly, because obviously you want that. You don't want to embellish things, but then also including as much as I can about their personalities, their drive, their interests, what made them tick, so that people can connect to them, relate to them, and have sort of an emotional connection.
I love how you give that round or 360-degree view of the human inside the uniform. You know, it's almost like going from black and white pictures to 3D color imaging. And if I go back in time to my former self, this would be a dry subject. And if I saw a military museum and that was on my way to whatever, I would drive past it and I'd be like, ugh, I don't know, like, why would I go there? So I'm curious, with your influence, the way that you perceive and the way that you develop these stories to create the exhibit, how do you make sure that women feel invited to participate in that slice of history?
That's another good question. What you're describing, driving past museums because it's not something you can relate to, that makes complete sense. A lot of museums, especially historical museums, are what I like to call stuff museums. They have cool stuff. They have lots of cases of neat stuff, which is great. Sometimes stuff itself is interesting and it's fun to look at. But if you really want people to connect to it, you have to put the human aspect back into it. So for a woman driving past, say, a military museum, you would think, oh, well, maybe I haven't served, it's tanks and guns
There's
and
nothing in there for
bayonets.
me.
Right, this isn't my kind of place. But now the story that I just related about Sergeant Custard being a widower, that's a story that I think a lot of women can relate to. A lot of women are mothers, they have nieces, nephews. And so by presenting sort of this human aspect of it, that pulls women, I think, back into history. For myself, I am not a veteran. My background is military history, but I've never served. And for me, what pulls me into that subject is the fact that I can relate to that aspect of their service. I can relate to being away from home. I can relate to not knowing where your next meal is going to come from. Things in my life that have happened are things that I can identify and pull out of their lives, which then helps me connect with them. And I think in history, it really needs to be presented in that way. Long term, there's a lot of issues with historic preservation. How do we get the next generation involved in saving buildings, saving artifacts, seeing value in these things so they're not thrown away or that kind of thing? And because they don't have an emotional attachment to what that old thing represents, who used that old thing, what would happen in that old building, etc. And so if you can present history in a way where people can relate to it, that will completely change how things are preserved, how museums are experienced by people, and how things are really saved and retold to future generations.
You remind me of doing family history work, and I had this round, it looks like a placemat, and it meant nothing, but I couldn't understand why my parents put it on display, a placemat. And so when I moved into my own house, I thought, oh, that's pretty. I'll put it on display. And I asked my parents, I said, what is this? Because without the story, it literally could go to Goodwill. It's just a placemat. And they described that it was embroidered by either my somebody. And so then it made me actually appreciate why and how it became so beautiful and so important. And I've never met that person in my family. And it matters now because I feel some kind of connection.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And one of the things that I often say is, the difference between an antique store and a museum is the interpretation.
Ooh.
And the more interpretation that you have, and the more you can go to an emotional level in the interpretation, instead of just an object label saying, this is a bayonet for a Springfield 1863 musket. Okay, I would find that in an antique store. Yeah. That's not, I would find that written on a tag for sale, So who did this belong to? What battles was it in? What tell me about it.
Well, I think it's a wonderful approach that you take to interpreting history, because you're making it personal to us. And that's something that probably hasn't always been a real strong policy in museum exhibits years past. So what you're doing is really valuable, I think. Have you actually been able to meet any of the descendants? I obviously way down the line.
For my research on Preston Plumb for my Forgotten Senator book, I actually have met several of his descendants. They've been incredibly kind, incredibly supportive. I've been kind of semi-adopted. I'm an honorary Plumb now, but they've been wonderful. They opened up their family archives to me. Some of them have even gifted me things. It's just been incredible. And it means the world to me to be doing research on Preston Plumb or these 11th Kansas soldiers and having the support of the families, them saying, yes, we're happy with what you're doing. We're proud of what you're doing. Sometimes when we're doing this kind of work, I don't want to say it's thankless. Sometimes it's just kind of a hard grind. We're always researching the next thing, working on the next project. And when you can have a descendant come up to you and say, thank you so much for telling my ancestor's story. Thank you so much for getting a headstone for my ancestor. It's a real stark reminder of this is why I do this. And realizing that you're having that kind of an impact on families, descendants all over is really amazing.
More places need to include that search to find someone who is a descendant because of the potential treasures that could be found and because of that validation. And I feel like that is important as a descendant. I've had some of my family stories been told by other researchers and historians with absolutely no contact to the family, and the material is okay, but it's not quite right, and it's missing so much that we have to share. If they had only reached out, and it could have been more robust and more alive, and we would have been proud of it rather than, oh, someone wrote about us, so I appreciate that, and I would encourage historians and institutions to take that to heart. It's not that hard to find a descendant now through Ancestry or Genie or other programs. Just try.
I found a lot of great information in archives and museums, and I found a tremendous amount of information from the families themselves. And I feel as if you're just going to museums, archives, the typical places for research, and you're not trying to contact family members and descendants, it's like going in with one boot off. You're missing a lot of information.
That's so exciting. So in your career, when you reflect on your career, is there anybody who played a pivotal role in shaping your thought process and your dreams and your goals?
I would have to go back to my work at the Veterans Museum when I worked with John Goss, a retired Army major, and I really got a feel of working with veterans there, understanding kind of how veterans tick, that sort of thing. And he was the one that started the idea of each case in the museum was a specific veteran story. And that really clicked with me. And I thought, this is how it should be. For me, as you start presenting history, like with the 11th Kansas and this exhibit we did at Fort Caspar, I wanted to basically recreate that somehow, only I didn't have the stuff. I didn't have the things to put in cases. And so I did 22 biographical panels of 22 different soldiers. So each panel is its own, essentially an equivalent of that. It's the portrait of the soldier and it's their biography, as much as we can tell. And so as you're going through the exhibit, yes, you're looking at weapons, you're looking at what I would consider more the stuff type displays, but peppered throughout that are all of these individual stories of Sergeant Custard, of, soldiers that started businesses together after the war.
That reminds me of the play that just came out, Hamilton just came out a while ago, but Hamilton, and how that became accessible to every demographic. We all enjoyed it because it went beyond the political position to all the different little nuances and the technical things that happened behind the scenes, and even the after. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but the ending of, going past that person's life to see the ripple effects. And I love that they started businesses together. Even I've heard many stories about how if one is soldiers lost, the buddy will go and take care of their family for them. And that stuff warms my heart.
Say bringing up Hamilton is a great example. That's a subject of American history that I think a lot of people would have thought, oh, this is really dry. The amount of people who were familiar with Alexander Hamilton and his life story prior to that play was very small.
Yeah.
And that play comes out, and now all of a sudden, so many Americans know Alexander Hamilton. They're interested in it. And when you have something like that, that's artistic, that's a play that takes, maybe some artistic license with certain things, I'm all for it. That's great. A lot of historians don't like, movies. They go after him. Oh, well, this is wrong. He's got the wrong hat. He's wearing the wrong, this and that. And I think, I don't care, because if this movie gets people interested and they go to the library and they get a book and they, and they read about it, that's fantastic.
That the ball rolling.
Exactly.
I was just going to ask another question about prioritizing your work and your life balance. I mean, obviously, also part of that question, you've obviously taken some risks in your career. And how would you advise other female historians? How would you encourage other female historians?
I would encourage other female historians to tell them whatever it is they're thinking about doing, go for it. Absolutely go for it. I was an intern at the Wyoming Veterans Museum. I was 25 years old. I had friends that lived in Los Angeles. I went out to visit and they said, you should get a job out here. And I thought, okay, I'll try. And I applied for a museum director position in La Quinta outside of Palm Springs. And I got it.
Yeah.
I went straight from intern to director, which is a huge time saver.
Yeah.
It was a multi-million-dollar, museum. It had a large budget. It was a very prestigious area of the state. And I ran it for 3 years successfully. It was a huge risk. I put all my stuff in a budget truck and drove it to California. I knew friends in LA, which is a lifetime away from Palm Springs. If you've been out there, I mean, with the traffic, it's hours away. And so I was there all by myself. When I came back, I was in the midst of grad school when I came back to Wyoming. And so I was putting myself through grad school in history. And I decided I wanted to start my own business. And so I did that in 2012, offering museum consulting. And so I was traveling to museum conventions like Colorado Wyoming Association of Museums, with a little booth, and this is my business. This is what I do. And I was offering consulting services to other museums for exhibit design, fundraising, working with boards, working with city government. And it was just got to the point where I realized I've done a lot from this firsthand experience of all of these things that I've accomplished. And so I just carried that with me, things like this headstone project at Fort Caspar. Yes, it's expensive. It's going to take a while to raise the headstones. I'm going to do it. It needs to be done. I would tell women that are interested in things, especially if it's a subject matter like military history. Oh, this is, there aren't many women in that. Who cares? Go be another one. There's a few of us there. You can do a tremendous amount of things. Don't be self-limiting. Don't let other people tell you you can't, because you can.
Johanna, this is all the time we have today for this delightful interview. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and that you've been doing, and we will look forward to your long and industrious career. We know there's so much more to be learned from your experience, but we're also delighted to have the opportunity to pass your story down to others who may have questions and who may want to look further into your life or into their own lives in their own personal past.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.